This is the fourth lecture in the Western intellectual political tradition. I want to touch briefly today on the Jerusalem-Athens tradition, looking at Jewish myths and Greek myths and their perennial significance for us today. There's a tendency when people are looking at the Western tradition to pit the Jewish tradition, which is what is seen as a revelatory tradition, Yahweh or El Shaddai or God, speaking to what was to become the Jewish people, guiding them through time, through history. But it's a tradition in which humans in and of themselves are incapable of understanding the nature of the divine. It's only through a revelatory heritage that, in fact, people come to understand and see how they are to live and orient themselves through time. That's a way of which the Jewish tradition has understood. So revelatory and not philosophical. So philosophical meaning people who actually have to reflect and think through what it means to be human, how they're to live their lives, and what the relationship is between they and the ultimate, and the nature of that, and the penultimate and anti-penultimate. Often the Greek tradition is then seen, again in a caricatured way, as a philosophical tradition. It's a tradition that employs reason and thoughtfulness and logic and empirical ways of knowing and rational discourse and premise, conclusion and following arguments. And so you get these two ways of understanding Jerusalem and Athens pitted against one another. Needless to say, in studying the Western tradition, those are both caricatures of two great traditions. One which continues, obviously, in our day, in not only the Jews in Israel and their relationship to the Palestinians, but also the huge Jewish diaspora. No community is homogeneous, which is I think anyone who minimally thinks about anything knows that. And so the Jewish tradition passed in the diasporic phrase, the return to Israel. Even the diasporic Jewish community today is not homogeneous. It goes anything from right-wing to center to left, to a very devotional, revelatory tradition, to a very philosophic tradition. And so within the Jewish tradition, it's a complex heritage in which people come from an ethnic background. Some just convert to Judaism, but it remains an ongoing and living tradition. The Greek heritage, which has consciously played a significant role, often the West looks back to classical Greece, the Parthenon, Plato, Aristotle, Roman tradition. These are seen as foundational to Western civilization. Very rarely, if you're at university in the humanities studying the great works of civilizations, do you study the Jewish tradition. That would be studied maybe in a synagogue or a seminary or a Bible school as a part of the Christian or Jewish heritage. But that's often omitted except for more thoughtful courses at university, in which the fullness of the Western tradition is brought together, which includes the Jewish, the Christian. But it's often the Greek tradition and the humanities and humanism which is seen as the foundation of Western civilization. And so classical Athens and Sparta, Peloponnesian War, Roman civilizations, the statues, the arts, the literature, the humanities, education, that's seen as a standard bearer of what education might be or could be. Obviously it's been co-opted by technical education today and shallow reactionary against the Western tradition, usually by people who know very little about it. So they have caricatures of it, just as they do of the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition. And so, sadly so, you get many seemingly educated people in the humanities spouting off rhetorically about things they really know nothing about in any substance. And so they go picking and choosing small little cherries on a much greater orchard, claiming that that's what the orchard is all about. Meanwhile, they picked a couple of maybe bad cherries, and then they said all the orchard is bad cherries. Very, very shallow in terms of what's going on. But the Greek tradition, or Athens, which of course there's more to the Greek tradition than Athens as well, is seen as a significant sort of source of the West. And so when we think in Western intellectual tradition, the Jewish, Jerusalem, Athens, Sparta, and there's other city-states are foundational, but Athens has been priorized of all of them just because it reached such a peak of thought, of philosophy, of culture, of the arts, of architecture, Parthenon, music, mathematics, all of these important elements of learning. Now I want to touch a little bit on two elements where in fact Jerusalem and Athens have a great deal in common by dipping into some of their myths, which have perennial relevance. And when I use myth, I'm not talking about two things that a myth is not. One, it's not a falsehood. It's eternal truth wrapped in a garment of a story. And two, it's not necessarily historical truth. And so people think that only historical truth, factual truth, literary truth is what truth is. But a story or a myth, because it's not historical, must be an untruth. It's a bit like saying Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter are untruths. They're myths. They're not historically truths, but the truths, Star Wars, for example, but the truths embodied in them, although not historical, and many of the creatures in those stories, most students don't go to Hogwarts, and you're not likely to meet dwarves and Uruk-hai on your daily walk through town. They're obviously not historically true, but the truths in them of cynicism, skepticism, power abused, friendships, go on with the perennial truths within them. They're significant. And so myth in that sense, it's not necessarily historical, even though history itself is a myth. How we interpret history is a form of a myth. It's an attempt to smoke out, evoke certain truths. And so history is often a series of repeated myths in that sense. Comedies, tragedies, tragicomedies. So myth is not necessarily historic true, but it's also not a falsehood. So between the notion of myth as falsehood and only truth which is historical is true, stories are interesting, but they're irrelevant when it comes to hard facts of empirical truth. Myth transcends those two caricatures of understanding the human soul and journey. So I want to look at a few of the myths within the Jewish story, and then just a few myths within the Greek story to give us a sense of how Athens and Jerusalem in many ways are not at odds. I might also include the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, key work in the Mahabharata. I was doing my doctoral studies. I had in my background in Oriental tradition, particularly Indian, do work on the two great Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as well as the Chittaparakaram, key work in southern Indian epic literature. But let me at this point, and then we can draw in as we're moving along eventually some of the great Indian myths as well, which have overlap with Jerusalem and Athens. Same perennial themes that you'll get, as I mentioned, in things like Harry Potter, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, because they're perennial truths about the human condition and choices and consequences. So the Jewish tradition, the Genesis is the first book in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis is just a Greek word meaning beginning, genesis in that sense. So it's the beginning of all myths, or the foundation of all myths, or the foundation of all truths that to be ignored is to lead to serious consequences. The first of the great myths, of course, is the Eden myth. Now, of course, you get literalists who want to find out when did Eden exist, where did it exist, can we find the geographical location, can we find the time that it did exist, where might it be? That's not the purpose of the Eden story whatsoever. The Eden story is very much about a tree. The tree symbolically has always been in great world civilizations the soul. So the question that always has to be raised when you think tree metaphor, does a person have any roots? If a person has no roots for their soul or the tree of their soul, the winds of time will often blow them over. If they have no stability, no depth to them, they're often a victim of their time. If there's no center to them, no grounding to them, they're blown all over. And so the first thing to note in the tree myth of Eden is each person has to ask themselves, where are my roots, or do I have any? And if not, what does that make me as a human being? The second in that great myth is that God says to Adam, Adam just means humanity in that sense, so it's not a literal person, is that the fruit on your tree, like desires, many of the desires I have given you are good. Enjoy them. Pick from that tree of certain desires. Enjoy them because you're meant to. But don't pick from the fruit of certain desires, because if you do so, there are serious implications for yourself, for other people. So within the tree of the human soul, there is a range of possibilities. Some desires pick from, others are poisonous, they're toxic. If a person indulges in them, they get swollen appetites and narcissism, and they begin to lose their way. That's what it means to be east of Eden. East of Eden, people become separate from who they truly are, and then in terms of they become victims of colliding desires. So the Eden myth is very much a story about what does it mean to be, and how does one prioritize desires and be discerning about picking from the fruit of certain desires, while discerningly knowing which desires to be honored, to be lived from, which lead to meaningful understanding of the self, of the other, of society, and the public good itself. So the Eden myth is very, very much, it comes back to, and which gives it a perennial relevance, is the nature of the tree of the soul. What's the roots? Is the trunk strong? Usually if it's not rooted in anything, or shallow soil, so where is a person planted? If they have thin soil, then they're not likely to have strong roots. And when difficulties come in life, painful experiences, betrayals, disappointments, if the roots do not go deep, the tree of the soul can be blown all over the place, and then people become vulnerable to a great deal of hurt and pain and disappointments. But if the roots go deep and the fruit is good, and people don't pick from certain desires, the life journey will be more meaningful. The next step of the Eden journey is, of course, Adam and Eve, which are the two elements of the human soul, the male and the female, are cast out of Eden because they have indulged in picking of the fruit of problematic desires, lower desires, lesser desires, indulgent desires, and they're cast east of Eden, and as it were, the angel, metaphorically, they can't get back to themselves. And so they get lost in terms of their own journey. It's what Dante talks about in the Divine Comedy, going into a dark wood and not being able to find clearings of meaning anymore. And so they're east of Eden, but does God in the story come and condemn, given people make problematic decisions, chastise, judge? No, the voice that comes of God is, now you've made that decision, where are you? And it's not as if God somehow literally doesn't know where they are. He's asking them psychologically, given these decisions, where are you as a human being? How do you understand yourself at that point? And so the story of being east of Eden, which is John Steinbeck picks up, and what it means to live in a post-Edenic world, because the biblical story is very much we live between paradise, Eden on one hand, New Jerusalem on the other, and this in-between phase is a world of longing for the good, and yet the experience also of painful realities. And so both humans and civilizations live within these tensions between the longing archetypally for what they long to be or where they've come from, and then the reality of broken relationships, disappointments, positive experiences, and the tensions in living in that be between, in one sense, a comedy, positive things happening, and tragedy, sadness is happening. So that comedic, tragic story is grounded in the biblical myth of tragicon, which Shakespeare will pick up on his great works as well. And any great work of literature looks at these. And so the early myths of Genesis really key in on choice, identity, making meaningful choices that lead to positive consequences, being wary of picking from the fruit of certain longings, desires. Because often people, out of their emptiness, their loneliness, their hurts, their harms, Their desire for something more meaningful, which is legitimate longing, can often choose things which then betray them. And so the longing for meaningful relationships is legitimate. What a person turns to, or the fruit that they pick, can cause greater harm. And so people are often caught in a very, very difficult dilemma between legitimate longings for meaning, for purpose, for relational integrity, but the choices that then are made to fulfill that desire increase the problem if it's not a discerning decision made, and then it increases then loneliness again. And so the Genesis myth is very, very much about that. The other one would be the Cain and Abel myth, which is you get the story of Cain. He's very much what today you would call a very driven entrepreneur. He's about making a quick buck. He's about aggressive entrepreneur. And so he's successful at one level, but he, in many ways, God says to Cain, you've lost your way, just as your parents, Adam and Eve, have by picking from the root of problematic desires. Abel is very much the contemplative, the shepherd of being in that sense. Abel moves slower. He's content to watch, to be still, to listen, to see, to wait. So he embodies that contemplative heritage. And Cain becomes envious of his brother, becomes envious in the sense that he seems to be living a deeper, a more meaningful life. Cain is always on the run, always on the make, always finding some new project, some new quick way to be successful. And essentially God comes to him and he says, Cain, there's got to be more to you than this. Slow down. And Abel is living a much more meaningful life, a much more contemplative, centered life. And inevitably then Cain becomes jealous of his brother, because he seems to be, even though Cain is more successful at one level, he's a deeply driven person, dissatisfied person, out of touch with himself. And so he gets to the point where the highly aggressive, entrepreneurial, jealous Cain, who is successful at one level, but at a deeper level, very unsuccessful, very unhappy, he kills his brother Abel. And so this myth, the Cain and Abel myth, is really about the aggressive vita activa, the person who's a victim of their own drivenness, who's a slave. They think they're free, but they're so driven, they're in a cage, they're going round and round in the smallest circle turns. Envious of the Abel to the point where they grow to hate. They hate that element, and in hating them, they hate that element within themselves, actually. That contemplative, that going slower, and they become addicted to a hyper busyness. And so in that Genesis myth of the Cain and Abel, you have a vita activa, or the driven, sort of the Western driven entrepreneur who does not know how to be still, addicted to busyness, accomplishments, productivity. And you have the contemplative Abel, and then the activist, Cain, kills the contemplative, the shepherd of being, because he's jealous of the attention Abel is given by people. He's relationally sensitive, he's attentive to others, and God chooses Abel over Cain simply because what Cain is his parents on steroids, picking from the fruit of trees which are even more toxic. In that sense, it becomes a drug, this busyness. And so Abel sees through his brother very clearly. He doesn't want to deal, Cain doesn't want to deal with his addiction. So rather than dealing with it, he projects his anger on Abel and kills him, both literally and metaphorically. Anyway, this is what happens in our society today. The thoughtful, the contemplative, are very much maligned. They're marginalized by the Cains of our culture, who only think of making money and busyness and franticness and their inability to slow down. And when they meet someone who's a little more at peace, slowing down, sees things deeply, they don't know what to do with them, so they caricature them, they demean them, they dismiss them. And so I did a story once called, it's now being published and doing the rounds, called The Woman and Her Hawk, that looks at these issues as well. It's really just the Cain and Abel myth. And so what we have, a couple of these myths, I've just briefly touched on a few of them in the Genesis myth. is very, very much one's about desire, longing, but longing for what? And where do people turn to for meaning and purpose? In the Greek tradition, you get exactly these sorts of issues in terms of choices being made, facing into the interior of the human self on the journey. And so, for example, in elements of Greek myth, just as Cain listened to the wrong voices inside, so in Greek myth there's the sirens. The sirens are always whispering their sweet, their seductive songs. Listen to me, follow me, hear my message, hear what I have to give. I will lead you to the land of happiness, of plenty. And when people uncritically and undiscerningly listen to the shallow sirens within that sing their sweet and seductive songs, they're led into places which go to their own destruction and hurt and harm. And the Greeks were keenly aware of the internal sirens that are in people's lives. To deal with those sirens, for example, in the Hercules myth, you're dealing with the great myth of the Gorgon heads and the Hydra heads. Now, of course, one can again look at a myth like that as, most of us literally don't hear sirens outside calling us in a certain direction, but we do know internally there are sweet songs that can be sung that can lead people away from the Eden of their true being. The Hydra head is for Hercules and then his nephew as well. He's on the mission to do what is right and just, and he has to face the Hydra. Now, it can be literally an external hydra with the many heads that you chop the head off, it returns. But it's also the hydra head of various elements within the self which are unhealthy. And a person can chop off, for example, momentarily the head of anger, or the head of bitterness, or the head of lust. So you lop that head off as Hercules did, but the head grows back on again. The hydra of insecurity, the hydra of cynicism and skepticism. There's many heads to the hydra within. And so for Hercules and his nephew, if you keep chopping the head off of, say, anger or bitterness or cynicism, skepticism, power dynamics, dominating others, these are all hydra heads within. But merely to chop off the head does not mean it goes away. The head grows back on again. In some Greek myths, two heads then grow to replace the one. So how do you destroy the hydra in that sense? Well, merely to chop off the head is not to destroy the hydra. So Hercules then has to go actually the hydra itself. From once you've killed the very hydra itself, then the heads themselves, which are symptoms of the hydra. And so in Greek myth, the hydra is a very important element of the soul. What are those various heads which are negative within? As I mentioned earlier, it can be bitterness, anger, cynicism, power, lust for money. That's the Midas touch, always wanting to have more and more. But of course, relationships then turn to frozen gold in that sense, and then the meaning of real relationships are lost when people only see others in a transactional way to get what they want. That's the Midas myth in that sense. And so the hydra head, like the sirens, has a great deal of affinity with psychological analysis of the human soul and desire and longing, and how people deal with what Jung would call the shadow side within. And so Greek myth is thick with a multiplicity of myths that, when read in a non-literal way, but in a psychological, existential way, speak about anyone if they know themselves in even a minimally meaningful way. Obviously, Plato's cave is yet another one. Most of us think we live in a world of light. In fact, most of our life is living in a world of shadows in a cave. And the fullness of what we could be is denied us because we live in a small little world that we confuse with reality. And the nature of a true philosopher is to see a shadow for what it is, for people to name that the small little things they turn to for happiness are just shadows. There's nothing really of substance to them. As Henrik Ibsen once says, take away a person's life lie and you take away their happiness. The life lies are like little shadows people live for, and they usually are relevant, but people give a lot of time and energy to them. Then they wonder why they're dissatisfied, wonder why they're restless, wonder why there's a sense of disappointment and cynicism in life. Well, they turn to all the wrong places. And of course, our big media industry just panders to people's shallowness and longing for meaning rather than taking people to greater depths in that sense. Obviously, the myth of Paris that leads to the Trojan War. Paris was given a choice as a young man, so 3 goddesses come to him. Hera says, I will promise you all the kingdoms of this world. This is Jesus' temptation. Asia, Europe, if you will choose me as the goddess. Athena says, I will give you wisdom if that's what you wish, if you choose me. And then Aphrodite comes along and says, life is really about indulging your physical, your sensual, your sexual desires. So Paris is a bit of a cad and a fop in that sense. He only thinks of images. He only thinks of shallow relationships. And so Aphrodite gives him his wish. And of course, Helen of Troy, face that launched 1,000 ships, she's unhappy in her marriage to Menelaus. It's not particularly... So she's vulnerable to a very attractive person coming along, promising her all sorts of delights and amusements and titillations and distractions, which will take her to a place where she thinks she's going to have meaning, and Paris sort of promises that. And so in this sense, this myth is what, depending on what a person chooses, they're going to lead to tragedy, or they're going to lead to a meaningful life. Paris is a shallow male in that sense. He follows the Aphrodite lead rather than Hera, or more meaningfully, Athena. And so the Trojan War itself, so Greek myth again, is what part of a person is each and all choosing from? Because there's various siren songs. The sirens themselves can lead to problematic places in terms of choice and consequences. There's the temptation of power, Hera and Zeus, or there's the one of wisdom, Athena. And so these Greek myths, and there are many, multiple myths indeed in Greek thought, but they have convergences very much with the Jerusalem tradition of liberty, in an unexamined way and indulged in a certain way can lead to serious consequences. But liberty, when it is informed by wisdom and insight and picking from the fruit of legitimate desires versus problematic desires, lead to a wise, insightful, mature person on their human journey versus a person that's always frantically running to and fro in meaning, like a dog chasing its tail, but never finding meaning. You can't help but feel sorry for people like that, but there's many people like that. Paris embodies the male version of it, and of course in Greek myth there's female versions of that as well. And so the notion that somehow Athens and Jerusalem are opposite, one revelatory, one's philosophic. Well, if one enters the mythical tradition of these great traditions, that say a lot about human identity, human desire, human longing, human thirst for meaning, and where people turn to quench those thirsts, those hungers. Certain, as it were, tables are properly prepared that nourish and feed the human soul and mind and imagination. Others betray it in the long run. And so myths are stories passed on to us from the Jewish tradition. I just looked at a few of them in Genesis. And the Greek mythic tradition that, when read in a proper way, speak very, very much, not only then, but obviously because their truths are perennial, they speak to us today. And so when we move into the Jewish and Greek mythical tradition, we get stories that transcend time, ethnicity, place, geography, and speak to us today. And so to dismiss these great myths is to render us quite impotent and incapable of making sense of our own journey and how we make choices that are meaningful and authentic or genuine versus shallow and silly choices that lead to ever-increasing restlessness and addiction to sillier and sillier cultural issues, which lead in an ongoing way just to unhappiness and unfulfillment. And this is where the state is a lot of people today, is just the sheer malaise of not knowing where to turn for meaning, because these myths have been taken away from them, and so they don't know how to choose, that they don't have the heroines or heroes anymore to make sense of. And so desires are indulged from the wrong places that then lead to places in which people are perennially restless because they turn to the wrong places to fulfill a deeper and legitimate hunger for meaning and purpose.